Good afternoon. This is another opportunity for Environmental Justice Now, June 11th to 2021, Juneteenth. Our topic, lack of transit access as a form of oppression. We're welcome and so thankful that we're having another opportunity to come to you live. Hello again from Virginia IPL. Our team had a series of discussions and a conversation about all of the ways that, intersectional ways that oppression impacts the lives of the people that we serve and ourselves. And that conversation led to questions about how can we talk about equitable advocacy in a way that covers all of the topics. And so out of that conversation, we thought about Juneteenth coming up and what the importance of Juneteenth and how we wanted to honor the reality that for several decades, in fact, more than a century, people in this country were enslaved. African people were enslaved. And the Juneteenth is a day that we celebrate the reality that finally, June 19th, 1865, the information finally reached the people in all the way in the western part of the country at the time in Texas to let them know that the slavery and emancipation slavery had ended and emancipation had come. So our series of topics are related to many of the campaign and issue areas that we are concerned about. And so today our topic is lack of transit or public transit access as a form of oppression. And today we have with us our Faith Leadership Manager, Ralph Hodge. Ralph Hodge comes to us right here from Virginia, and he is our one of our newest hires here at Virginia IPL. Say hello, Ralph.
Hello, how are we all doing today?
Wonderful. And then we also have Karen Campblin, who is she's not our, but we claim her anyway. She is the Virginia coordinator for NAACP on Environment and Climate Justice Committee Chair. That's just one of her hats. And if we would cover the entire screen if we told you all of the work that Karen does across the state and in order to advocate and to organize for justice and to relieve oppression that many people are continuing to experience. So let's jump into our topic today. How in your mind, and we'll start with you, Karen, how in your mind has public transportation policy been a form of oppression historically? So in other words, what are the historical struggles that people experience or what are the roots of it related to public transportation? And why is this an important topic for us for today?
This is a great question to start the conversation off with. I think, as we celebrate what Juneteenth is and the independence that it was to provide the enslaved and be able to afford them the opportunity to participate fully in the academic and economic, social, and cultural areas within our country, we still were plagued with, various forms of racism and oppression. And transportation is one of those, the big infrastructure that was used to continue to establish and implement various policies that continue to perpetuate, the Jim Crow laws that had moved after that, or the Black codes and those types of things. So as we're supposed to be celebrating freedom, we had transportation infrastructure that was constructed through established and vital and self-sustaining communities. We know of how the development of the U.S. intrastate highway system was built by destroying Black and Brown communities. Transportation policy and funding and resources towards our public transit services was done in a segregated manner, and was also done to continue the perpetuation between the separate residential opportunities for Black and Brown communities, where it was, developed to support the suburbs to get to the employment centers, but it was also used to segregate the Black communities away from economic opportunities, away from academic opportunities and social amenities.
Yeah, so I think, obviously we think of the one of the major successes of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, and the boycott, the bus boycott in Alabama, right? And that is kind of a landmark for us to be thinking about when we talk about the ways that public transportation has been used to keep Black people who were ancestors of formerly enslaved, in a state of perpetual oppression, and really at the margins of society, unable to fully participate. So I think we do recognize those historical roots and connections, and the realities are that much of that has not been fully exercised from our policy, our state codes, and the way in which, even across the state of Virginia, the way that transportation authorities operate. So there's a lack of synergy, a lack of conversation, a lack of actual thinking together about how we can make, particularly in central Virginia, as well as in the Hampton Roads area. Ralph, what would you like to add to that?
When I think of Juneteenth, I know a lot of us like to celebrate, but I was raised on those old Daughters of the Confederacy edited history books, so I didn't learn about Juneteenth until I went to one of our great historically Black colleges, Howard University. And so when I think of Juneteenth, for me, it's always a historical marker of delayed liberation, delayed justice, delayed freedom, with emphasis on delay, and delayed simply to keep a system in place that favored and enriched the white power structure of this country. And so when I think of transportation, even before I even think about public transportation, just transportation in general, it's always been about limiting our movement and our ability to go from one place to another in this country. And then, we think about the idea that we had to avoid sundown towns, so we had to have green books to travel, or during the Great Migration, when they had those vagrancy laws that arrested you at bus stops and kept you from fleeing the South. It's always been limiting our movement to control us, to enrich the white power structure in this country. So for me, Juneteenth, I know people celebrate it. For me, it's always a reminder that things are delayed. And then when you jump into public transportation, it's delayed access. It's delayed. It's the same story, delayed opportunities. And so, MLK said, he said that public transportation is a civil rights issue. And it still rings true today. When the civil rights era leaders were fighting dual systems of education, they said, well, it's unequal. We have dual systems of transportation. One system has faster routes, more frequent routes. One system has less routes and slower routes. One system of transportation has more amenities, one has less. Some have shelters, some have dirt paths to wait for the bus stop. So you still see that it's separate, two systems of public transportation. And so I still see it as a Juneteenth in a situation that it's still delayed, but still waiting for what should have happened years ago to really happen now.
Yeah, I think that's a really important, a lot of what you raised is extremely important to this discussion, right? The idea of continually delaying equity and equality in the systems that are necessary to be fully integrated into society. And that's really what's at the crux of a lot of the advocacy work that Virginia Interfaith Center, Interfaith Power and Light does related to environmental justice and environmental advocacy. That we are, highlighting and bringing to light the places and the spaces and the ways in which we continue to need to infuse, embed, rethink, so that we can have equitable access and affordability for the public good. And that, when you think about it, that a lot of that has to do with, when we're talking about it from the perspective or from the lens of Juneteenth, obviously we're talking about Black and Brown people who and indigenous populations who had, directly had laws, curtailing their movement. But in fact, the reality is that once we have a system that is equitable, everyone benefits. Everyone will be able to access public transportation at greater frequency, more amenities, more accessible for all the populations that need to get around, who need access to cultural events, to shopping, to physicians, to educational settings, locations. So this is really a critically important part of what it means to be part of a society. To have access to public transportation or to have access to transport. Karen, did you want to follow up with any thoughts on what we've discussed thus far?
And I think one of the big thing, and I'm really glad you brought this up, but and I didn't really realize it, that Martin Luther King Jr. was kind of a planner. He really talked about the beloved community and talked about how these policies, as you mentioned, Ralph, in Atlanta, where he actually identified and stated these policies are intentionally being implemented to segregate and limit and hinder access to the Black community. And he spoke, about, as he did with equal justice for all. He also spoke about equal justice and access to transportation and, better living conditions and standards, and working together to build that beloved community. And here we are in 2021, and we're still working towards this beloved community that Martin Luther King Jr. Was describing for us back then in the 60s and 70s.
Yes, thank you. And I think when we think about Juneteenth, yes, it should be, there is something to celebrate, obviously, but there is a somber aspect to it, right? That we're recognizing that, it was a great evil. Mm-hmm. Slavery was a great evil for this country in many ways. And no one was left uncorrupted by the institution of slavery. No one. So, oftentimes when we talk about in Juneteenth and the history of enslavement in this country, oftentimes people relegate that to just talking about and thinking about Black people or indigenous people. But the reality is that as perverted and perverse an institution as it was, it actually corrupted every aspect of life in this country and actually in the Western world. And so we can't really talk about this issue in an isolated way, and which is why we recognize the importance of having this discussion about all the way the intersectional nature of oppressions and the ways in which the work that we do seeks to undo and disentangle and dismantle those structures. So what is transportation equity? What are the transportation equity issues that currently exist in Virginia? Can you give us some examples of those, and maybe then we can move on to what are some ways that we are addressing them? Karen, would you like to go first, or?
Yeah. Okay. So some of the equity issues that we are experiencing here in Virginia pretty much mirrors what we're noticing nationwide. Is going back to what we were saying, is how the transportation system was designed, and we're still feeling the vestiges of those oppressive type of intentionality that was used to develop those transit agencies, in which transportation was used to bring Black and brown bodies into the suburbs to work on as domestic help, or whatever other type of service type job that was there, and get them out before sundown. And then the suburbs, the transportation system was set up to just send them into where the high paying, high quality jobs were, and to get them to go home. And so they kind of had like this mandate to say, when you develop your transportation system, consider service, convenience, and attractiveness for those who have the means of getting around other than transportation, the transit system, and then just get people there and back if they need transportation. So we have this group of transit development, the transit dependent and reliant are given, older fleets, poor service. As Ralph said, where are the bus stops with shelter that's not on a really busy highway that's right up, where are the safety standards that have been put into these transportation systems and amenities? And so that, that's one of the easy observations of looking at what our transit system provides. And then you look at how much does it cost? The further out we have the issue, as you said, Faith, with our land value or property value. And so at the further out you are from the high quality activity and employment centers, you tend to have higher fares. So another equity issue is, how do we provide affordable housing in relation to the location, as well as the socioeconomic status of everyone else. And then we make sure that the transit service itself is safe. How reliable is the equipment that's being used? And are we using the best technology everywhere, and not just within the affluent communities? And there's so many more, but I'll just stop there for now.
Okay, Ralph, do you have some thoughts on what transportation equity issues we are currently experiencing, particularly in Central Virginia?
Well, Central Virginia with GRTC and even Hampton Roads Transit are, I think, two of the worst funded transportation systems in the country. So just a simple, if you underfund something, you don't have to do much else. You're going to get poor service. You're going to get fewer routes. You're going to get less opportunities. And so just the mere fact that GRTC and HRT in our state are some of the worst funded systems in the country per capita automatically puts our people who don't have a lot of resources at a tremendous disadvantage. Because now, just as Karen said, the employment centers are now, it requires you to have a car. And if you don't make that much money, then if you don't have a car or trying to afford a car, then you're paying a tremendous portion of your income goes to car costs, gas, insurance, and just your car payment. You think only 3% of the trips or the transit trips in our state are done through public transportation. So we don't invest a lot in public transportation. When you look at the difference of how much money we spend on our highway system versus our public transportation, automatically you see, okay, where is the money being put? It's put to those who have cars in those communities that are accessible by car versus people who don't have cars, and how they're able to get to their employment, or how they're able to get to social amenities and do other things outside of maybe getting to a particular job. And so just the mere fact that we don't fund it at a level that makes it equitable is one of the biggest issues, from my opinion, from my perspective.
Yeah, I think that's critically important, that the way that the transportation entire system is funded needs a complete overhaul. And again, recognizing that much of the way the patterns of funding are related to those Jim Crow era realities of continuing to keep the segregation. So what are some of the solutions? So we've named a few, we've named some of the issues and the problems. What do you think might be the best approach to solving some of the issues you raised for us, Ralph?
I think one of the things that people are experimenting now is just overall reducing the fares or going to zero fare. When they looked at during the COVID time, I guess we're still in COVID, what they're realizing is that a lot of the people that use public transportation have to use public transportation. And that level of ridership didn't go down that much during COVID. And so allowing them to have zero fare is a great way to help people who don't have a lot of money, because when you don't have a lot of money, I think the income of those who are riding is pretty low, under $25,000, and some under $10,000. And so you're talking about spending $600 or $1,000 a year for transportation, just riding the bus back and forth to work. You're talking about taking out a significant portion of someone's income, and then you put them at a further disadvantage. So I think one of the solutions is reducing the fares or going to zero fare for our ridership.
Yes, that's one of the creative solutions that we've discussed on one of our earlier Environmental Justice Now shows with Karen and others. Karen, do you have some other ideas about some of the resolutions that we can, that legislators, that policymakers, that, folks who are on these transportation boards ought to be thinking about related to, making public transportation much more equitable and accessible for people of every income level, but particularly making it accessible for people who really owning a car is actually a major burden and really actually overburdens their household monthly budgets.
I think that's kind of like a twofold response. There's a cautionary tale that let me do the cautionary tale second. The first one is going back to what Ralph had mentioned, that there are two different types of transportation systems, right? There's one for the choice rider, and then there's one for the dependent. The choice rider, somebody who owns a car, right? They can get in their car and drive to a park and ride lot and take the transit into wherever they need to go, like let's say downtown DC. And Metro allows them to avoid I-66. And then when they get home, they get back in their car and they drive home. If you're a transit dependent rider, you need something to get you to point B the moment you walk out your door. So that last mile has been ignored for decades because there was never a need for any consideration for that last mile. How does that transit dependent person get to the bus stop or the metro rail station or whatever they're going to have to be? So looking at that can be in the form of improving our sidewalk, adding sidewalks, widening sidewalks, or repairing sidewalks. Safety for children and women traveling alone in particular, improving street lighting, changing out street lights to LEDs. Plus, we also know we see better in LEDs, so it's a lot safer, and it's brighter. Having access to bikes, scooters, but also have a pay system that doesn't require a bank account, because we have to consider the unbanked, whether by necessity or by choice. And so there are all these other different amenities that we need to look at the last mile. The second part, which is the cautionary tale, is now that we're improving and increasing the walkability of these communities, we have to make sure that we're not also introducing factors that's going to promote gentrification. And so things have to be put in place to allow the existing residents to maintain their property and live there. And that could be in so many different forms in which we assist those residents and have them at the table talking about all of these things from day one, when it's still a seed of a thought of change, making these changes, making these residents aware. So it's kind of like a two-pronged approach. We need to improve the transportation infrastructure, even down to that last mile level, but we have to be very cognizant and very intentional on protecting the existing residents from gentrifying pressures.
Can I chime in on that?
Yeah, yes, please do.
I think I like what Karen was sharing, because when you talk about improving the pedestrian infrastructure for that last mile, one of the things I don't think we talk about enough is how often people in our cities get, and especially children, are hit by cars. And you see the rates they're hit by cars is oftentimes they're walking from that bus stop, that last mile home. And the sort of sidewalks are important, but that whole safety issue, I mean, I think a child in the city is like something like 4 or 5 times more likely to be hit by a car. And it's normally in that last mile home. That's a big issue. And I think also Karen hit on something in regards to affordable housing is a big issue. And so when you talk about gentrification, oftentimes when they improve accessibility in these areas, there's not an intention to make sure that we're adding affordable housing in the areas where we're adding more accessibility to bus stops. And actually what often happens is the exact reverse. When we have housing that is unaffordable for most, that's when they start making access to those bus stops more available. And so it's a weird cycle. So if there's not that intention that, okay, we need to make sure we're doing affordable housing, then we are going to get that, like as Karen said, that cautionary tale of now we gentrify the area and giving the wealthy more access and have pushed the poor further out.
I think that's critical. I think that that's critically important, and it helps us to transition to my next question, and it really has to do with the moral responsibility and the moral message that comes with this conversation. Recognizing again, like a lot of what you said, both Karen, you, and Ralph, takes a certain kind of will, a certain kind of will, and a certain kind of desire to do what is good for everyone. A belief in the commonwealth, a belief in the common good, a belief that there's something important about sharing and being a part of that larger, broader, expansive, beloved community that Martin Luther King talked about. And that, in faith traditions now, we talk about it as the kingdom of God, right? So what are the moral, right? Not the kingdom of God, but the kingdom, a play on the idea of being kinship. So how do we infuse that message into these issues related to advocacy for these intersectional oppressions? Because that's really the work that we're hoping to do. Our long range objective is actually to create the kind of community, the community ethos that understands, public and common responsibility, but also and does that not as a not as a burden, right? But as a reality that says we are moving forward together and building a better world because of the ways that we contribute to the whole. What do you say? I'm gonna start with you, Karen, because we know This is an issue that we hear all across the state, right? In many sectors. And I know you hear it serving with the NAACP because you work with a number of different sectors and communities, some that are maybe more religious than others. But what's the moral message that we can carry or take to our, community, our local communities to help them understand this issue and why it's so important for us to think creatively and equitably about public transportation?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's basically it's an ethical and moral obligation to protect our inheritance for our future generations. And one of the biggest ways that we when we advocate for better legislation and policy, and we go out and we talk to folks and we try to learn from our differences to identify our similarities, and then once those similar demands are identified, we figure out a way to move forward in unity. And so it's developing that stewardship. It's developing that, going out in fellowship and finding that common ground. And I think that is how, I think that's the only way we're going to be able to find a solution. There's not a one size fit all solution for every community. And each community should be able to identify what they need at that time. But we also have to recognize that these plans are fluid and they will change in the future. So we have to be open-minded to understand that this is something that has to grow with what our needs are, and to make sure everybody has equal opportunities to access it. But, the right thing to do is moving towards public transportation, because it is a very crucial point in protecting our natural resources. It reduces the needs for so many things, whether it's the land for the road, whether it's our mental capacity in traffic. It gives it frees up space to lower our travel time to spend with our family and friends. There are just so many different things, and it opens access. I would prefer not getting behind my wheel of the car unless absolutely necessary. And there's a sense of freedom even with that.
Ralph, tell us what moral message and what way do we approach this conversation that can spark and inspire that level of creativity, but also goodwill to make these changes that are necessary to make it possible for everyone to have access to equitable transportation?
I think from me, I start with the perspective that in our country we do a very good job at demonizing the poor and subsidizing the rich, and I think that's something that in my faith tradition we talk about Jesus flipping tables or turning systems over. And so if this country does a good job of demonizing the poor and subsidizing the rich, we have to flip that in the sense that we have to uplift the poor and call for generosity from the rich. So from our perspective, that's one of the things we have to do with transportation. I think in our country, we've demonized those who had to use public transportation and kind of looked at them as the least and the left out, as opposed to seeing them, as you shared, the kinship. Well, this is my brother, this is my sister. We're all in this together. You should be, if I have access to the grocery store, I have transportation to get there, you should have access to get to the grocery store. If I have access to go to the library easily, you should have access to go to the library easily. Now, I may not need as much to get to the library, but if our goal is for both of us to be able to get to the library or get to school or get to work, then I don't start from what you have. I start from what you and I both need to receive. And so I might need to make sure that you have more and more invested in in your transportation needs and my transportation needs, because ultimately I want to see you at the same place. I want to see you get to where I am. And so that might require me to make sure that you have more, or our government make sure that you have more. So what we've done in this country, we've subsidized the rich. We've given those who have more, and then told those who don't have anything, hey, figure it out. And I think from a moral standpoint, that's not right. You're asking those with less to do more and asking those who have more to do less. So there's something wrong with that equation. And I think for one of the things we have to do from an environmental standpoint is to continue to flip that table. From an environmental standpoint, when you think about some of our urban communities are closer to higher, denser traffic patterns, and they're dealing with more of pollution and in Richmond, we're number 3 with regards to asthma. I don't think that's a coincidence when we have very low public transportation resources in our cities. Some of our communities are right, the highway runs right in the middle of it, and so you see all that. And so for us to say, okay, it's fair to you to live in an area where there's higher pollution, and I'm okay with that. Your child is suffering, has a lower air quality than my child, and I'm okay with that. That's a moral problem. I think we have to flip that.
I think both of what you bring to this conversation related to the moral and ethical issues are incredibly important. And, we need to, as we are doing our work, that's the work that we need to do as well. Yes, we want to see electrification of the transportation system, bus system. Yes, we want to mitigate climate change for, global climate change and recognizing the global climate crisis. But the reality is that if we're going to achieve a world that is worthy of leaving to our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and whether we have children or not, to the next several generations, right, the 7th generation, then we ought to be thinking about the ways that we can better the quality of life for everyone coming behind us. And so this was a really rich conversation. We are pretty much at over the 30-minute mark, so we're going to wrap up this conversation today. But look forward to future conversations with you, Karen, because you, again, bring not only your wear that hat of the transportation guru for the NAACP in Virginia, but also for so many other issues. And so we look forward to speaking to you again and having future conversations with you, as well as Ralph. We work with you every day, and we're so excited that you're part of our team and that we're able as an organization, as a nonprofit, to think about all the ways that we can help make life better and raise the quality of life for everyone. Thank you again for tuning in. And as you see on the Chiron, we have if you want to join our e-news and get more information about what Virginia Interfaith Power and Light is doing related to transportation or any of the issues that we are focusing on for Juneteenth this month, please join us. Go to that bit.ly link and join us. Again, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone.